everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 19th. And as you know, last class we viewed the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, considered to be the first feature-length horror film. And it's very much an art film, as many of you indicated in your discussion forum responses, that it oftentimes is regarded as one of the best examples of German expressionism. Though I do recommend Nosferatu, which we will be talking about shortly in reference to Dracula. But this silent horror film, and that means that it would have a soundtrack with a live orchestra in a theater in which it was playing. So we can never know for certain what the soundtrack would be. But obviously, soundtracks give quite a bit of emotional resonance to a particular story. This film, when it came out in 1921, had premiered in America, at least in 1921, to mixed reviews, but now it's considered to be one of the highest art films that exists. And obviously, it's symbolic, as many of you had talked about in your discussion forum responses. The most common way of reading the film, particularly if we read the film without that narrative frame, which was added in only after the fact, is to view Caligari as a representation of German authoritarian structure. And that Caligari is very, um, let's say, skillful in being able to control Caesar, who might be considered to be the German masses, who basically are sleepwalking and don't realize how and why they are being controlled. And Caligari makes it his business to make sure that he enacts revenge on anybody that he thinks has questioned his power or authority. But once we add that frame in, it completely changes the narrative. And now we've got a much more even complex narrative about the idea of sanity and insanity. And perhaps the true horror, as I've suggested before, is not knowing the difference between the two. And this idea of the subjectivity of reality and the ability of reality to be distorted through a narrative or through an individual giving a narrative, I can't help but think has rather contemporary relevance to today. Just think about how artificial intelligence has made it so difficult for us to be able to distinguish between fact and fiction. Certainly, this has become a political issue as well. At the time, the 1920s, obviously, we're seeing the very beginnings of film. It's one of the reasons why I had put these films in chronological order, because I wanted you to see the progression, not just thematically, but cinematically as well. And filmmakers, contemporary filmmakers like Tim Burton, for instance, are obviously influenced by films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. If you are familiar with some of Tim Burton's imagery, I can't help but think specifically of Edward Scissorhands, but generally the style of Tim Burton. And that said, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is not necessarily considered to be the definitive horror film. I suppose if I had to identify one, it would be the first American horror film. And that leads us to Dracula, or what's considered to be the first American horror film. So this would be in 1931. So this would be approximately a decade later. You can see this in the notes below in the second section. And we talked a little bit about some of the fears and anxieties of the 1920s, especially in Germany, because Caligari, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is a German film, but globally as well. And obviously, the consequences of a world war, or what was considered to be the war to end all wars, is embedded within Caligari. 1930s obviously was also another tumultuous time, and that said, the probably biggest element of the 1930s is, or at least from most historians' perspectives, is the Great Depression, which allowed film to serve as a kind of escapist entertainment, which I think makes sense in terms of what Stephen King argues in Dance Macabre, a text that I've referenced before, when he talks about the appeal of horror film. He argues that it's cyclical, it oftentimes speaks to particular generations, but even more than that, it allows a certain level of escapism so that there is horror in society, but not too much horror in society. And I do remember after 9/11, which was a very horrific time, where there was discussion that that could be the death of horror film just because of the horrors associated with those events. But of course, time moves on, and upon reflection, individuals probably have realized that previous horrors existed and future horrors will occur. So that was hardly the death of the horror film. If anything, we've been seeing a resurgence, and I would argue that's because of some of the political and economic anxieties that we're facing, as well as technological in our current time period. But we began the class talking a little bit about the origins of horror film, which would be related to Gothic literature, a literature that began in the text, The Castle of Otranto, usually considered to be the first Gothic text, not particularly well written in the 1700s. And then in the 1800s is when we get these definitive texts that have basically captured public consciousness because of film more often than not. And this is where you get your Draculas and your Frankensteins and your Dr. Jekylls and Mr. Hydes and so forth. And these texts from the 1800s were loosely, I emphasize that, loosely adapted into American films with Gothic sets. And in addition to the Great Depression in the 1930s in America, there was obviously the threat of European fascism, Eastern communism, anti Semitism, eugenics, and the women's vote, and some of the fears about the power of female. And it's one of the things that I've talked about in terms of Nosferatu, or I'm sorry, in terms of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, though it could be applicable to Nosferatu as well, is the way that female is portrayed. And obviously in Caligari, female is portrayed as object and that which is to be owned and protected. If you remember some of the tropes that we had discussed with Gothic and horror, is that oftentimes there was a damsel in distress that needed to be saved. So looking at Caligari and even more so Dracula from that lens can be absolutely fascinating. But usually we view Dracula, both the text and the film, from a symbolic perspective. Now, the film version was initially adapted in 1921 to screen, and that is Nosferatu, and that is a wonderful example of German Expressionism. But it's a bootleg version. There was never permission to make that into a film. Some names and some dates were changed and so forth, but it's pretty obviously a mirror of the major themes in Dracula. And the widow of Bram Stoker tried everything within her power to have that film destroyed. Luckily for us, it wasn't. Because again, when we talk about German Expressionism, as important as the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is, more often than not, people talk about Nosferatu and the incredible use of shadow. And if you look in the notes below, you will see that I've got a couple of links that you can look at so that you've got some visuals. Now, the 1930 or 31 version of Dracula, the one with Bela Lugosi that our American audiences are so familiar with, that basically influenced the idea of vampires in our public consciousness, was directed by Todd Browning. He's known as the father of American horror film, actually. He argued that most people are morbid, and that might be true. I'm not necessarily sure. So, Dracula was identified by the Library of Congress, the U.S. National Film Registry, as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. which is actually going to be related to our attendance question, because after you see the film, I'm going to ask if you agree or disagree with that. Note that Dracula did not originally have a musical score. And again, these are the early days of film. I think it helps to lend to the eeriness of the film, that we're focusing on sound effects and that silence can be quite frightening. If you've ever seen a contemporary horror film called A Quiet Place, you can know how frightening silence can be. Now, Todd Browning is best known for either Dracula or another film that he did in 1932. So this would be pre-code. It was known as Freaks, and it was banned because Browning used actual circus freaks in the story, and it was thought to be just too grotesque. And again, if you look in the notes below in the second section, you can see that there's a link where you could get a visual of some of the actors. I can tell you that it's a tale of retribution. That's all I want to say, because I don't necessarily want to give away too many spoilers in the event that you want to see it. But again, in terms of dates, 1931 would be considered the first American horror film, and that would be Dracula. And that also appeared before Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein as a text was written before Dracula. So, a couple of points about Dracula and Bram Stoker's brilliance in naming his primary character after Dracul, which means son of the devil. And Dracula has a historical significance of Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, a cruel Roman Empire conqueror who was known for basically impaling his victims and actually having those impaled heads on swords surrounding him when he was having an outdoor dinner. Again, if you want to see some visuals, look at the third section of the notes below, and you will see a picture of Vlad, and you will also see a woodcut of him, let's say, enjoying his meal, surrounded by the macabre impaled victims. The story of Dracula actually goes all the way back to Frankenstein, which was a text that was written before Dracula. It was a text written by Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley, being connected with Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet, was vacationing along with some friends, and they were experiencing some rather dreary, inclement weather. So they challenged each other to write a ghost story. And reputedly, the way the story goes is that evening, Mary Shelley dreamt of the what we consider the great Frankenstein creation scene of a life being reanimated, and that led to the story itself. That's something that I talk about in my Gothic literature class, actually. But one of the individuals who are involved in that storytelling competition, the Dr. Polidori, who is friends with Mary Shelley, ended up writing a short story called The Vampire. And it's thought that this short story helped to inspire Bram Stoker's tale. So Bram Stoker was able to use historical references such as Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, the son of the devil, was able to use some of the storytelling with short stories such as The Vampire. A lot of folklore associated with vampires as well. In fact, one of the earliest instances of vampirism occurred in New England. If you think about this area, it basically was the oldest, or I should say it was, or it is the oldest part of the United States, that the British came and they established a New England, and here we are. One of the earliest cases was reported in Vermont in the late 1700s of vampirism. And folklore has a long tradition of talking about a vampire, whether you want to think of a literal being that's living off the life force of another, or you want to think about it from a symbolic perspective. Both work very nicely. If you know anything about the time period, then you know about consumption, or tuberculosis as we know it, that will oftentimes mimic many of the same symptoms associated with vampirism: a loss of energy, very pale skin. And also during this time period, it was not unheard of to have a premature burial. Individuals would be buried, and then after the fact, it would be found that they were alive when they were buried. Science wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it is today. In fact, One of the more interesting things about the time period is that corpses would oftentimes be buried with a bell tied on to, let's say, something like a foot or a toe, and then that string would rise up to the above ground area where a bell would be, so that if somebody was prematurely buried and they did come to, and when they were in their coffin, they could move and ring that bell and alert outsiders that they were indeed alive. And if you know anything about Edgar Allan Poe, who was writing during the 1800s, then you'll also know that being buried alive and his fear of being buried alive is oftentimes highlighted in his text. So this was a real possibility. And the idea, again, of the folklore associated with the vampire, much of it was developed, at least the folklore that we think of, through Bram Stoker's novel of the vampire. The idea of not being able to see a mirror image, because mirrors oftentimes are supposed to be reflections of the soul. Christian objects being used to defeat evil, because vampires are supposed to be symbolically associated with evil, and Christian objects are supposed to be symbolically associated with good. This is a theme that we will see in many horror films, where Christianity defeats that which is considered other or alien or dangerous or monstrous. And of course, the idea too that vampires can't be in sunlight, or a lot of the vampiric mythology that we've associated with vampires was initially established by Bram Stoker and Dracula, of course, best known for the film version in 1931, though it started initially as a Broadway stage play. And interestingly, many of the stage conventions associated with that play, such as the cape and collar, basically transferred over into film. There was a very practical reason for a cape with a collar during the Broadway stage play, that there would be a trap door in the stage, and the actor needed some kind of disguise, who's playing Dracula, to be able to escape down the trap door to appear as if he vanished into thin air. And the costume would be the cape with a standing collar, which would have mechanical arrangement so that it would stay standing when the actor was no longer in it. And of course, Bela Lugosi and his role has helped to define everything we think about with Dracula. And Bela Lugosi learned his role phonetically. He was not fluent in English, which is one of the reasons why we have that sort of halting, stilted pronunciation, which again we have associated with the character of Dracula. And some of the things to think about before you see the film, if you know the text, and I encourage you to read it, is the text is much more complex than the film, which is oftentimes what happens when films are adapted from text. The film is going to condense the plot and definitely the characters. And there is a lot of Christian imagery and a lot of religious imagery in the film that I will talk about very shortly. And there's lots of symbolism associated with vampires and in the film as well. So, in terms of finding these particular films, you can stream them, obviously, through streaming services such as Amazon and YouTube. The GCC library has the DVDs of all these films, so you can watch them there or work through interlibrary loan. Whenever possible, I'm going to provide you, or try to provide you, with free online links. And luckily, I was able to find an online link for Dracula through the National Archive. I don't believe it's closed caption, but I was able to find a transcript for the film Dracula that I've also included in the notes below. This is in the 4th section. The film is an hour and 15 minutes. So at this point, we are at 19, almost 40. Now we are at 1940. So what you might want to do is stop at this point and watch the film and then return, so that we can talk a little bit about the film, so I'm not giving away spoilers. What you might have noticed if you've already seen the film, and note that I try to give you the films and the links a week ahead of time so that you can watch them at your leisure, but I encourage you to give multiple watchings to films. I usually suggest three viewings. The first just for experiencing plot, and the second for analysis. So the first is what's happening, the second is why it's happening, and then the third is to refresh your memory before you actually talk about a film or you begin to study a film. And as you know, in addition to our discussion forum responses, we are also writing journals. So your first journal will be due today, and your journal is on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and that is approximately a page or so of reflections and thoughts submitted to me via PDF, which is how my grading program works best. And that's to Ruiz. So my email is what works best, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And I'm evaluating them informally on a checkmark system. So a plus is excellent, check plus is very good, a check is satisfactory, so forth and so on. And that's where most of the grades range in that first three levels. And the idea behind that is that by the ending of the semester, you'll have a running commentary on what you've noticed in the films that might be important. This will certainly help you in terms of thinking about the final exam, which will be cumulative. And what that means is that you will be able to address anything throughout the course of the semester. It will be an essay exam, open book, open notes, and because this is an online situation, you would have 24 hours to respond. And normally, if it were face to face, you'd have a couple of hours to respond. And I don't expect you to spend obviously 24 hours working on it, just a couple of hours. But since it's open book, open notes, you can reference things such as the discussion forum responses. You can reference things such as your journal, so you'll have all of those notes in front of you. And eventually we're going to start talking about a final project for this class where you focus on a particular element of something we're discussing in this course. And you could end up coming up with ideas in your journals. And certainly, if I see something that I think could be an idea for your final project, I'll indicate that when I review the journals. I think of it as a kind of running conversation between us. So they're not evaluated for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And again, you can certainly write more or less, but a page or so is about what's average. And what you will see, I think, is some themes and commonalities that will carry over the course of the semester. Now, our first film was a documentary, Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, based on one of the first books or one of the textbooks that I had ordered for class. That's more of an introduction, so you were not required to write a journal on that. But you are required to write a journal on all the films, and that would begin with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So basically, my thinking is that we watch a film, we talk about it, and then your journal is due the week after. But of course, you can submit in a journal early if you so wanted to. So next week, your journal would be on Dracula because we are going to be viewing and talking about Dracula. And some of the things that I encourage you to look at. One or several of the images of Dracula, he's wearing this large star, and it's been compared to the Star of David, and that basically Dracula could symbolize or represent that which is not Christian. And the Star of David, of course, is associated with Judaism. So this could be a commentary on religions outside of Christianity being portrayed as negative or evil or other that need to be defeated. That said, when you are watching the film, there will be some silliness. So when you are seeing, for instance, or if you've already seen the film, which is what I recommend, the armadillo in Dracula's castle, these large Gothic sets that really overshadow and overpower everything, these arches that oftentimes are like Gothic cathedrals. There's no good reason for an armadillo to be there outside of the fact that Browning liked armadillos and it was his film, so he could do something like that. Censors talked about the idea that good had to prevail over evil, which is one of the horror tropes that you will see, particularly in the early days of horror film. And those death groans of Dracula, oftentimes censored out just because of the sexual associations with them. It's no surprise that vampirism is oftentimes associated with sexuality. If you read Bram Stoker's novel, it's a highly erotic novel. And the idea of the stake serving as a kind of phallic symbol, the bite also serving as a kind, the fangs as a kind of phallic symbol, and the death groans being perhaps representational of climax. And if you read Bram Stoker's Dracula, you'll see that it's much more graphic than that. And in fact, there are episodes that seem to suggest oral sex, but it would have been appropriate and considered to be acceptable in Victorian times, which were known as highly repressive times in the 1800s, particularly with sexuality, that people could read content like this because it wasn't technically supposed to be about sex. It was supposed to be about vampirism. And in the end, evil was conquered through good. All of the Christian imagery, and we're going to see this in multiple films throughout the course of the semester, that Christianity is portrayed as Savior. So this is very much sort of an establishment and a reestablishment of the status quo. Thinking about who is the victim and who is the victimizer from a symbolic perspective, and whether you want to view Dracula as perhaps a blood-sucking capitalist, which would make perfect sense in the 1930s, a time sort of struggling with the Great Depression and with economic challenges. Of course, Dracula being very much the aristocrat, and also the idea that Dracula comes from a foreign country, a basically almost reverse imperialism, and some of the xenophobic fears of the time period of foreigner. Dracula and vampires could represent that as well. Note that one of the things that he wants to do when he's in Transylvania is to learn as much as he can about British culture and to acquire British and European real estate, which again could be the fear or one of the fears of foreign invasion. But the biggest fear probably is the idea of the European female being corrupted by the foreigner. And that very much is indicative of what we see in Dracula. Notice how often his victims are female, and it's only when the more shall we say, the higher class females that are under attack. That's when society starts to pay notice. There's basically a peasant flower girl that's initially attacked, and it doesn't really make much of an impression on anybody. But once European women are attacked, this idea that foreigner could invade European female and dilute bloodlines. And obviously, blood is the life, as Dracula says oftentimes. And the idea of bloodlines is embedded within the symbolism associated with a vampire, as well as the fear of death and death and everlasting life. You might be familiar, or perhaps not familiar, with someone named Countess Bathory. And she basically was perhaps one of the first serial killers who ever existed. And she was known for killing and then bathing in the blood of virgins in order to keep her eternal youth. So there's this long idea of, and this was back in the 1700s, so that there's this long idea about the idea of blood being able to rejuvenate. Um, Certainly, the past invading the present, which is one of the things that we talked about, is very much a horror film trope. Dracula representing the past. And if you read the novel, it's much more obvious that Dracula represents a land of superstition and past, um, antiquated, if you will, technology as compared to Europe, but Europe is still under threat. Science and religion is a fascinating way to see this film because it offers an ability to blend both. So you might be familiar with the Van Helsing character from other stories, but basically Van Helsing, as you will see in the film, is a man of science. But he also is able to merge that with religion. So he has spirituality and faith, but he also has the scientific method. So one does not negate the other. In fact, both are necessary, particularly with much of the Christian symbolism associated with defeating the evil of Dracula. And the animalistic nature of Dracula can be just compared to the idea of the animalistic and bestial nature of perhaps humanity as a whole, whether you want to view that from an economic perception about the consumption of from a limited number of individuals sacrificing the larger group of individuals. It's a motif we'll talk about again when we talk about the zombie, which is our one of our films from the 1960s. But I encourage you to watch Dracula carefully. I've found that as the years go by, fewer and fewer people have seen the original film, even though they've seen perhaps adaptations, and they are in one way or another informed through popular culture about what the film is about, but actually seeing what it is. And yes, that ending is going to be very, very hurried, and it seems as if the director Todd Browning realized that there was a lot more story to tell, which there was. But if you think about the average length of a film, which is slightly over an hour, especially during this time period, we get that rushed ending. But it's hard not to think of Dracula from a symbolic perspective, especially when we see Dracula entering the bedchamber and attacking the female at her most vulnerable moment. Even something like costume changes, we will see that as Mina falls under Dracula's power, she goes from wearing rather conservative clothing to rather revealing clothing. And I don't think it's any mistake that's Lucy, she is a loose woman perhaps, is one of Dracula's first victims. And if you were to read the novel, you'll see that Lucy is a much more developed character where she ultimately is contemplating three suitors. We don't necessarily get that in the film. Again, things are simplified, but the idea is that Mina is the good girl and Lucy might be the one that's a little bit questionable, is perhaps the reason why she is ultimately the one to die, and Mina does not. Again, I hope by this point that you've seen the film so that I'm not giving away spoilers. And the attendance question for today is directly related to Dracula and the assessment by the Library of Congress U.S. National Film Registry. Do you agree or disagree after watching the film that the film is culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant? And more importantly, why? And obviously, there's no right or wrong answer to this. I prefer to ask questions that require some reasoning and debate. And you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you're certainly encouraged to respond to your classmates. What you are required to do is to read your classmates' responses. And as you can see, I've been responding in turn, so that what you will find at the ending of all of this is a kind of summary, if you will, of what we might have discussed in a class if we were in a face-to-face situation. So next class, we'll put some closure onto Dracula, and we'll talk about our next film, which is representational of the 1940s, and that happens to be Cat People. And you can see that in the 7th section below, that Cat People came out in 1942. It's an hour and 13 minutes long. And once again, it's available for streaming via Amazon, YouTube, DVD at the GCC library or interlibrary loan. And I was also able to find a link. That link, I believe, does not include closed captioning, but I was able to find the screen script for Cat People, which I included. So that's what we will view and discuss next class. But for now, enjoy Dracula. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class and talk some more about upcoming assignments such as final projects. Take care. Bye-bye.